social networking sites as a separate. These models have yet to consider how the dynamics between social networking sites and the users themselves, the volume and behavior of false news as a separate entity from the users, confirmation bias as a driver of belief, and certain delays in the system. So most existing models only had a behavior of overshoot and collapse, and they haven't showed a behavior of recurrence, which is what researchers have seen when it comes to fake news. So some objectives of the study is to, of course, cover the people in both social networking sites and evaluate existing recommendations and interventions to develop the policies. So here's the base model that I will be expanding. So basically, the danger state is where we will be incubating where users are incubating with false news or with susceptible or infected people, and then infected people are those who believe in false news. And then latency is a stage where they temporarily forget about false news, but when it recurs, they can either become reinfected or they can become recovered. So after that, I'll be expanding into the causal loop diagram. So this reinforcing loop basically tells us that the more we infected users, those who believe, share false news, and then this tells the algorithm that false news is performing well on the platforms. So the algorithm will then recommend more of them because people are predicted to interact with them more. And then the next loop is the same thing, but when it comes to likes and comments or actions, it also has a better. It also increases the ranking of the post in terms of the algorithm, but it has a lesser weight when it comes to shares. This next loop is more focused on false news online, the volume of false posts online. So the more we share, the higher the likelihood of false news being recommended on our feeds, and it becomes there will be more people who can reach false news online. Here's the confirmation bias feedback loop. This basically says that the more we are exposed to false news, the more our bias builds up over time, and then we will become infected and eventually believe and either interact with the false news by sharing or liking, reacting, and commenting. So this is the rest of the system with the balancing loops. The one in green is the base model, and then the ones in red are balancing loops that are content moderation practices of existing online platforms. So next, I'll give the results in discussion. So the model was encoded as software diagrams in Stella, and the resulting behaviors is here. So we can see from the start, false news takes a while to build up. So we can see from before time at 5,000, it takes a while for false news to increase. But then we see that there's an exponential trend, and it's oscillating because there are already delays in the system. And then here, we see that the users and false news interact with each other because the peaks cannot intersect. So only when false users start to forget false news, it's only when the algorithm recognizes that people are interested in content like these. So that's only when they start to recommend the posts, and when the recommendation peaks, the users start to recall. So from latency, they go back to infection. So this is the behavior that most communication researchers have been describing, where false news is always recurring over time, since there are people who are actively pushing it to our social media platforms. So here we also see false news increasing exponentially because of the reinforcement loops. And here is the effects of false news with their bias. So we see that the more we are exposed to false news, bias also increases exponentially, and it also increases the infection rate of the users. So here we see that the results match the behavior of false news described in literature, where it recurs over time, and it's actively being pushed for people, and it's optimized to be clickbait in social media. And then quantitatively shows how society and media influences each other, like in communication theories, mediatization. Here we also see that false news exists in two spaces, so online and offline. So online we see that there's a sort of information pollution, and then offline we see that there's a problem with people with compounding biases. So scenario analysis. We have to counter bias as early as possible. So here, when bias is reduced at a delay of 2,500 units. In blue, we see that the oscillation dampens over time. But when it's too late, it's already the same as the base run. So we can say that when it's too late, people become entrenched in false news, sort of like a cult. And it also takes around roughly 6 months for people to be deeply entrenched in false news when exposed continuously. And here we also see that the volume of false news dampens over time. Next is a solution proposed by a scholar. Their main idea is to tax big tech and then distribute the funding to news organizations. Although it's a bit ideal, its main goal is to improve the trust in news, and then when people have agree with the shared truth, they will treat the false news post as a fleeting viral post, so they'll eventually forget it. And here you see it only occurs once. So we move on to our policy design. Here in blue is the policy design, which is a mix of different interventions. These are combining biases, countering bias and the tax policy, and also retaining the possibility of fact-checking backfiring as a reminder of false news. So here we see, although there's a few recurrences, it eventually dampens. And here in green, it's also a single occurrence of false news. In the base run, in red, the content moderation practices are only set as constants, but when they are set in as variables, so based on engagement, so moderation is only prioritized when the post has a lot of engagements, a lot of views. We can see that this is the current system we have now. There are a lot of infected people, and it really shows that we need restructuring of algorithms. And then here we see that false news is really exponentially higher at an earlier rate. So conclusions and recommendations. Current models on false news propagations only considered people and not social networking sites. The structure of algorithms create echo chambers for false news threads, and biases must be countered. Different ways to do that are restructuring the algorithm of social networking sites, a wide-scale educational program, and also a general idea is to just counter homogeneous spaces and promote diverse viewpoints in certain spaces. And again, biases must be countered, and trust in news organizations must be reestablished. So that can be done either through funding news organizations more, or right now countries like Canada and Australia are trying out a model where Facebook is being charged to index their content, news organizations' contents online. A few recommendations. Further studies can be expanded with the interaction of multiple social networking sites. We can use different communication frameworks for information processing. Consider the transparency processes of social networking sites, because right now we don't know the algorithms that's happening. It's being called a black box. And also data privacy laws and how it plays with false news, and the general data protection and regulation, which is being done in Europe, and ongoing antitrust lawsuits in the fiscal community. That's it.
Did you also come up with a stock flow diagram based on your causal loop diagram? Like, how did you get those graphs which you showed?
Sorry, what?
The graphs which you showed, like, how did you come up with those graphs? Like, did you make any
Yes, the causal
stock
loop
diagrams
were compared to the stock flows and
Achha.
encoded this.
Okay, that you have not shown here. Like, stock flow diagrams you have not shown.
Oh, that's not
Okay.
In your opinion, who should fund the news organizations?
That's a hard question, but in the proposal it said that it should be a third-party organization, so definitely not public governments.